The year was 1824, and the Carolina heat hung thick with the scent of sweat, iron, and blood. The plantations stretched for miles, fields of cane and cotton swaying beneath a merciless sun that showed no favor neither to the rich white masters, who lounged on their verandas, nor to the dark-skinned laborers who bled into the soil. Yet, among all those who toiled, one name was whispered with equal parts fear and reverence: Solomon Brant. He was said to have been born beneath an eclipse, a child who entered the world while the sun itself turned black. His mother, Lydia, a slave midwife, claimed she saw a shadow cross her newborn's face that day, an omen, the old women said, that the boy was touched by something unholy. The master, Thomas Caldwell, laughed when he heard the story and named the boy Solomon to mock the idea of wisdom among slaves. Yet as Solomon grew, it became clear that he possessed something that neither the master nor the preacher could define, a stillness that unsettled everyone around him. From his earliest days, Solomon was different. When other children cried out under the lash, he endured in silence. His silence wasn't weakness, it was defiance. Overseers took it as arrogance and they beat him harder, but still, he would not scream. The first time he drew blood from a white overseer, he was only 12. The man had kicked his mother for working too slowly. Solomon struck him in the throat with a hoe handle and didn't stop until the man's eyes went glassy. For that, he was whipped until his back looked like a field freshly plowed. He survived. The overseer did not. After that day, the whispers began. Some said the boy was possessed by the spirits of the slaves who had died before him. Others said he could call storms, that he talked to something in the swamps when the moon was full. Whatever the truth, Solomon's name became a curse and a warning. The Caldwells tried to sell him off twice, but buyers refused. No one wanted the devil boy from the Brant fields. As the years passed, Solomon grew into a man whose very presence drew silence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his skin scarred like bark, his eyes cold and gray. He worked when he was told, but every motion carried an unseen rage, restrained like a wolf on a chain. The Caldwell sons, Matthew, Elias, and Jonah, took special pleasure in tormenting him. They would tie him in the yard, make wagers on how long he'd last under the whip, and laugh when he didn't break. Yet behind his still gaze, something was festering, something patient and inhuman. The turning point came in 1836. On a Sunday morning when the bells of the church rang across the fields, the masters and their wives rode off in fine clothes, leaving the slaves to work beneath the sun. That night, the Caldwell brothers disappeared. Search parties scoured the fields, the rivers, the swamps. Nothing. The following week, one of the slaves claimed to have seen torches moving deep within the marshland. Then came the screams. It was said Solomon had taken them alive, that he dragged them into the swamp where no white man dared to go. For days, the night echoed with their cries. By the time the searchers found them, the brothers were unrecognizable, broken, bound, their skin burned, their minds shattered. Solomon was nowhere to be found. The story might have ended there, but it did not. Within a year, several white families vanished from nearby plantations. Their houses were found burned, their livestock dead, their daughters gone. The elders whispered that Solomon had returned and that he had built a kingdom of reversal in the marshes, a place where the masters became the slaves, where the order of the world had been turned upside down. For decades after, the people of Carolina spoke his name only in hushed tones. Parents warned their children not to wander too far into the swamp, for Solomon Brant still ruled there, waiting for those who carried the cruelty of their fathers. And though the plantation has long since turned to ruin, when the fog rolls thick over the Carolina swamps and the frogs fall silent, some say they still hear the sound of chains rattling in the dark, and a voice, deep and calm, whispering, "Now you know what it feels like." The story of Solomon Brant did not begin with rebellion. It began with silence. Silence in the fields, silence in the cabins, silence that thickened like molasses over every whispered prayer. Before he became the monster that white men feared, before his name was carved into the dark legend of Carolina's plantations, Solomon was just a boy born into the slow torture of existence. But even then, something about him disturbed those around him, not because he spoke too much, but because he seemed to see too much. He was born in 1811 during the total solar eclipse that blackened the skies above the Carolinas. To the slaves on the Caldwell plantation, this was no mere event of nature, it was a sign. Old Lydia, his mother, screamed not just from pain but from dread, for she believed her child had come from the shadow world, sent to either free or destroy them all. When she first held him, she said his eyes were the color of gray stone, not brown or black like theirs. Eyes that did not belong to a newborn but to something ancient. From the beginning, the other children kept away. He didn't cry when he was hungry. He didn't scream when he fell. He just watched the overseers whip men into the dirt, watched his mother scrub blood from the wooden floors, watched as the Caldwell sons took turns breaking the backs and spirits of those who dared defy them. By the age of 6, Solomon had seen more horror than most men saw in a lifetime, but he carried it like a quiet plague, unspoken and unforgotten. His first act of defiance came not with fists, but with eyes. The overseer, Mr. Porter, once told him to look away as his mother was punished for dropping a water pail. Solomon didn't move. He didn't blink. The lash came down again and again on his mother's back, but Solomon's stare never faltered. By the third strike, Porter stopped and took a step back, trembling without knowing why. He would later tell the master, "That boy's got something evil behind his stare." It was around this time that strange things began to happen. Tools went missing. The overseer's dogs refused to go near Solomon's cabin. One night, the plantation bell rang out at midnight, though no one had touched it. The slaves whispered that Solomon spoke to spirits in his sleep, that his words weren't English or any tongue they knew. Lydia wept and begged him to stop, but Solomon said, "They tell me things. They show me how to make them pay." The first man who tried to break him didn't live to tell the story. When Solomon turned 12, he was sent to work in the fields beside a hulking brute named Harris, a foreman known for killing 2 men with his bare hands. Harris caught Solomon watching him one day and struck him across the face. The boy fell, but instead of staying down, he stood, silent and unflinching. Harris hit him again, harder. Solomon picked up the hoe and brought it down across the man's throat before anyone could move. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just stood over the dying man, blood splattering his bare chest, and said in a calm voice, "He won't touch me again." The plantation erupted in chaos. The master ordered him tied to a post and whipped until he confessed to witchcraft. They beat him for hours, tearing flesh until his back was an open wound. But Solomon never spoke a word, not one cry, not one plea. When it was over, Thomas Caldwell himself said, "The boy should have died 10 lashes in, yet he's still breathing. What kind of creature are you?" From that day on, Solomon was no longer considered human in the eyes of the white men. He was an object of dread, a symbol of something they couldn't understand. They locked him in a shed for 3 weeks, leaving him without food or water, expecting him to perish. Yet when they opened the door, he was alive, weak but smiling faintly, as if he had seen something on the other side of death and come back stronger. The slaves began to see him differently. Some feared him, others worshipped him. They called him Oluwa's child, believing he was sent by ancestral spirits to bring balance to a world poisoned by cruelty. He began to lead midnight gatherings in the woods, away from the white man's eyes. There, under the dripping moss and pale moonlight, Solomon would stand among the others and whisper, "They think they own our flesh, but they do not own our souls." It was not rebellion he sought, but reckoning. He began to learn the ways of herbs, poisons, and roots from an old healer named Mama Roo, who lived deep in the swamps. From her, he learned how to make poultices that could heal or kill. He learned the songs of the old world, the ones that called upon shadows, and more importantly, he learned patience. "Vengeance," Mama Roo told him, "isn't fire, it's rot. Let it eat from within." When the Caldwell sons grew older, they inherited their father's cruelty. They made Solomon their personal target, humiliating him before the others. They burned his cabin. They branded his chest with the letter S for slave. But Solomon didn't retaliate, not yet. Instead, he watched them closely, memorizing their habits, their weaknesses, their fears. By the time he reached 25, Solomon's silence had become a kind of weapon. The slaves followed his unspoken commands. If he looked at someone, they understood. If he nodded, they obeyed. He had become something more than a man. He was an idea, a living threat to the hierarchy that had ruled the South for generations. What the Caldwells didn't know was that Solomon had begun preparing something dark, slow, deliberate. He no longer sought escape. He wanted inversion. He wanted them to live what they had inflicted. He wanted the sons of masters to understand what it meant to be powerless, degraded, and broken. And so, in the quiet of the Carolina summer, as fireflies danced over the swamp and thunder rolled in the distance, Solomon Brant's true purpose was born. The boy science couldn't explain, the man faith couldn't contain, and the slave no whip could break had become the embodiment of fear itself, a fear that would soon turn the masters into the hunted. That was the moment when Solomon Brant stopped being a slave and became something far more dangerous, a legend. The storm that struck the Caldwell plantation on the night of June 18, 1836, seemed almost unnatural. Lightning carved the sky like a blade, thunder rolled through the fields like the growl of an ancient beast, and the rain fell with such violence that even the masters stayed indoors, murmuring prayers. But deep in the swamp beyond the slave quarters, a different kind of prayer was being whispered, a prayer not to God but to something older, something darker. Solomon Brant stood beneath a twisted cypress tree, his skin gleaming with rain, his gray eyes reflecting the occasional flash of lightning. Around him, 20 men and women knelt in a circle. Their faces were shadowed, their hands joined, their breaths visible in the cold air despite the summer heat. Mama Rue stood beside him, her hands raised toward the heavens, muttering in a language that had not been spoken on American soil since the first ships carried chains across the ocean. "Tonight," she said, her voice trembling with something between awe and terror, "we do not beg the spirits for freedom. We demand balance." The slaves murmured in unison, their voices rising with the storm. Solomon looked up toward the big house on the hill, its tall windows glowing faintly, its white paint now streaked with the muddy water of the rain. That house had been his prison, his torment, and his grave. But tonight it would become something else. Over the months leading to that night, Solomon had carefully set his plan into motion. He had poisoned the dogs, loosened the hinges on the barn doors, and secretly carved a hidden passage through the swamp that led directly to the plantation's grain cellar. He had even gained the trust of Thomas Caldwell, Jr., the youngest son, using that trust to plant seeds of paranoia between the brothers. The family was already fractured. Elias Caldwell, the eldest, was cruel and ambitious, convinced the plantation was his by divine right. John, the middle brother, drank himself into oblivion every night, haunted by the memory of the slaves he'd whipped to death. Thomas Jr. was different, gentle at heart but weak and terrified of his brothers. Solomon had watched him for years, waiting for the moment when guilt would outweigh loyalty. That moment came when Thomas found Solomon in the field one morning, his back bleeding from lashes inflicted by Elias. Instead of walking away, Thomas gave him water and said quietly, "You don't deserve this." It was the first time any Caldwell had spoken to him as a man, not property. From then on, Solomon played his part carefully. He fed Thomas's guilt, whispering words of prophecy and redemption. He told him that the land was cursed, that the blood of slaves had poisoned its roots. He said that unless the family atoned, God, or something far worse, would take what they loved most. Now, as the storm raged, Thomas lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling, hearing the thunder echo like a warning. Downstairs, Elias and John argued drunkenly over inheritance, over land, over the ghosts they both pretended not to believe in. Their mother, Margaret Caldwell, prayed in the chapel room, clutching her rosary so tight that her knuckles turned white. At midnight, Solomon led his followers out of the swamp. The rain masked their footsteps. The wind drowned their whispers. They moved through the field like shadows, their faces painted with ash, carrying ropes, knives, and torches wrapped to stay dry. When they reached the main house, Solomon gave the signal, a simple nod. The first act of rebellion was not an explosion of violence, but silence. They entered through the servants' passage and extinguished every candle, plunging the mansion into darkness. From the upstairs windows, the faint glow of lanterns flickered, unaware of what was coming. Elias Caldwell was the first to hear it, a creak of a floorboard, a whisper too close to his ear. He called out, thinking it was a servant. No reply. He grabbed his pistol and stumbled toward the door, but when he opened it, the hallway was empty. Then came the chanting, low, rhythmic, growing louder. The voices of those who should have been asleep, or long dead. "Elias Caldwell," a voice called through the dark. "The blood you shed still burns." He fired blindly into the air. The thunder answered back. When the lightning flashed, for 1 second he saw Solomon standing at the end of the hall, soaked, shirtless, eyes glowing faintly gray, and behind him a dozen silhouettes, slaves he had once whipped, beaten, or sold. Elias screamed and fired again, but by the time the smoke cleared, the hall was empty once more. Downstairs, the other brothers had awakened. Chaos spread through the mansion like fire. Doors slammed on their own, windows shattered. Margaret Caldwell clutched her Bible, trembling, as the front door burst open and a gust of wind blew out every candle. When the lightning illuminated the foyer, she saw Solomon standing there, surrounded by those she thought long buried. "By God," she whispered, "what are you?" Solomon stepped forward, rain dripping from his face. "The one thing you tried to kill but couldn't," he said quietly. "The truth." Thomas appeared at the top of the staircase, pale, shaking, realizing what he had helped unleash. "You said there would be balance," he shouted. "Not this, not murder." Solomon looked up at him with something like pity. "You can't cleanse rot without cutting out the root." The next few hours were a blur of screams and thunder. The slaves took no joy in the killing, but they did not hesitate. Elias was dragged into the parlor and forced to kneel where he had once made others do the same. John was found hiding in the wine cellar, weeping and begging for mercy. Margaret died clutching her rosary, whispering prayers to a God who had turned his face away long ago. Only Thomas was spared. Solomon told him to leave, to carry the story beyond the plantation, to tell the world what had been done, not just that night, but for generations before it. But Thomas never spoke of it again. He vanished into the wilderness, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of madness. By dawn, the storm had passed. Smoke rose from what was left of the Caldwell estate. The fields were empty. The slaves were gone, disappeared into the swamps where no man dared to follow, and standing alone among the ashes was Solomon Brant, staring at the rising sun. He did not smile. He did not cry. He simply whispered, "Now they'll remember our names." From that day forward, travelers claimed to hear chanting in the fields of Carolina on stormy nights, and those who dared to build on the Caldwell land said the soil itself bled when the rain came. The world would forget the faces of the masters, but it would never forget the man who turned the order of power upside down. Solomon Brant had done the unthinkable. He had made the masters live like slaves, if only for one final terrifying night. The Caldwell mansion stood half-burned, half-standing, a monument of guilt and ruin. Its walls, once white as bone, were now blackened by smoke. The fields around it had begun to reclaim the earth, weeds pushing through the cracked soil like the fingers of the forgotten dead. It was weeks after the massacre, and though the air was heavy with silence, whispers of what had happened spread across Carolina like wildfire. To the townsfolk, the story was blasphemy. They said slaves had turned to devil worship. They said the storm had been sent by God himself to punish those who defied their masters. But those who walked too close to the remains of the Caldwell estate swore they heard something different, a low hum beneath the wind, like chanting coming from beneath the earth. For Solomon Brant, the man who led the uprising, there was no peace in victory. He and his remaining followers had fled into the swamps, living in the shadows like hunted spirits. But each night when he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, the masters, the mistresses, the brothers, all burning in the light of the fire he had started. He had dreamed of freedom his entire life, yet the cost of it haunted him more than the chains ever had. One night, as the swamp fog rolled thick and silver, Solomon found himself standing before the reflection of his own face in the water. He didn't recognize the man staring back. His skin looked pale, his eyes hollow, and the longer he stared, the more it felt as if something inside the water was staring through him. He leaned closer. That's when he saw it, a faint smile, not his own, spreading across the reflection. "Do you regret it, Solomon?" The voice came, not from the air, but from inside his skull. He stepped back, breathing hard, scanning the trees. No one was there. The only sound was the croak of distant frogs and the drip of water from the cypress roots. But the voice returned, softer this time, seductive. "You wanted balance," it whispered. "You took it, and now balance wants you." The next morning Mama Roo found him sitting beside the swamp, his eyes distant, his hands trembling. She placed a charm made of bone and ash around his neck and said, "You called the spirits, boy? Now you best start listening when they answer." That night they lit fires in a small circle and sang the songs their ancestors had forbidden themselves to sing for generations. They prayed not to the white man's god but to the Loa, the old gods of Africa, the ones who lived between life and death. But when Mama Roo threw bones into the flame, her face twisted with fear. "The spirit that answers you now," she whispered, "ain't one of ours." The following days were heavy with strange happenings. The swamp animals grew restless, vanishing from traps. Trees bled sap as red as blood. One of the younger men who had helped Solomon claimed to see faces in the water, whispering his name in the dark. By the end of the week, he was found floating face down near the same cypress where Solomon had seen his reflection. Solomon buried the boy himself. But while shoveling the mud, he noticed something else buried beneath, the corner of a wooden box. He dug it free, his hands shaking. Inside lay a small silver mirror, blackened at the edges, its surface cracked. The carvings around the rim were old, far older than anything crafted on that land. They were symbols, the same ones he'd seen burned into the walls of the Caldwell mansion on the night of the fire. He didn't tell the others about the mirror. He couldn't. Something about it felt wrong, but at the same time it pulled at him. He hid it beneath his cot and tried to ignore it, but that night when he lay down he heard the faintest whisper again. "You can't burn away what you've become." When he woke, his hands were black with soot, though no fire had been lit. The hauntings grew worse. Some nights he dreamt of the Caldwell brothers calling his name through smoke, their eyes weeping blood. Other times, he saw Mama Roo standing over him, her mouth sewn shut, pointing toward the river. When he would wake, she would be asleep, untouched, yet her eyes in the morning were always full of quiet knowing. Then came the third night of the blood moon. The swamp turned silver beneath a red-tinted sky, and the frogs fell silent. Solomon felt it in his bones, that same feeling he'd known before the storm on the night of the uprising. He rose from his cot and went to the edge of the water. The mirror was already waiting for him there, half buried in the mud as if it had crawled from the earth itself. He knelt beside it, unable to resist. His reflection looked sick, his veins dark beneath his skin. Behind him in the water's reflection, he saw the shadows of men, the ones who had died in the fire. Elias Caldwell stood among them, his mouth twisted in rage. "You set me free," the ghost said. "Now you're bound where I was." Solomon tried to move, but the air grew heavy. The ground beneath him pulsed like a heartbeat. The mirror's surface rippled, and in that shimmer another face emerged, not human, not divine, but something between both. Its eyes were endless and cold, and its grin stretched too wide. "You thought you broke the chain," it hissed. "You are the chain." The sound shattered the silence. Solomon screamed and hurled the mirror into the water, but the echo of that laughter followed him, deep and cruel. When he looked at his reflection again, it was gone. No image, no face, nothing. Only the dark surface of the swamp, calm and still like a grave. He stumbled back toward camp, shaking, and found Mama Roo waiting for him at the fire. Her voice was low, sorrowful. "You can't fight what you called, Solomon. You asked for justice. The spirits gave you vengeance. Now they want their payment." That night Solomon couldn't sleep. The fire crackled, and he felt the mirror's absence like a missing limb. He realized something terrible. His freedom hadn't broken the curse. It had moved it. The next morning one of his men went missing. Then another. Their footprints led to the edge of the swamp and vanished. No struggle, no sound, no sign of a fight. It was as if the swamp had swallowed them whole. Solomon knelt by the water again and whispered, "What do you want from me?" And from somewhere deep in the swamp the answer came, not in words but in a single reflection that wasn't his own. The devil wasn't chasing Solomon Brant anymore. The devil was wearing his face. By 1872, 4 years after the Caldwell massacre, the burned remains of the plantation had fallen into ruin. Ivy crawled over blackened brick, and the air around the estate always smelled faintly of ash. Yet despite its decay, no one dared tear it down. The locals swore it was cursed. Some claimed they heard screams from the ruins at night. Others said they saw lights flickering in the old windows long after sunset. But when Edward Hartwell purchased the property that autumn, He dismissed the rumors as superstition. A man of means and ambition, he saw not ghosts, but opportunity. The soil was rich, the fields vast, and with the war long over, labor was cheap. He brought his new bride, Clara, a fragile woman from Charleston society, to start what he called a civilized life away from chaos. On the day they arrived, the sky was an uncanny gray, and the wind carried a sound that might have been a sigh or a warning. Clara stepped from the carriage and froze. Though the grounds were still and silent, she felt as though eyes watched her from the tree line. "Edward," she whispered, "do you feel that?" He smiled indulgently. "It's the country, darling. You'll grow used to it." But Clara never did. Within days of their arrival, she began to hear strange sounds at night, footsteps pacing the upstairs hallway, whispering that faded when she turned her head. Once, she woke to the faint sound of a woman crying from inside the walls. She told Edward, who laughed it off as nerves. "You need rest," he said. "It's an old house. It creaks." But the sounds grew worse. One night she awoke to see her mirror fogged from the inside, as though someone had breathed on the glass from within, and in that fog faint words appeared. "We never left," Clara screamed, waking Edward. When he struck a match to the lamp, the writing had vanished, but the air smelled of smoke, old, faint, the scent of something long burned. The next morning she insisted they leave, but Edward refused. He was stubborn, proud, and determined not to be mocked by townsfolk for fearing ghost tales. Instead, he brought in workers to begin reconstruction, ordering the charred parts of the mansion torn down and replaced. Yet when the men began digging the earth to lay new foundations, their shovels struck something solid. It wasn't stone. It was bone. The workers unearthed what appeared to be a shallow mass grave, half-buried skeletons, their wrists still bound by rusted shackles. Among them was the charred fragment of a silver mirror, its surface blackened but unbroken. The men refused to continue. One swore he saw his reflection move, though he was standing still. That evening, Edward buried the bones again, commanding silence. "If the town learns of this, we'll be ruined," he told Clara, but when she stared at him, her eyes were wide, not with fear but understanding. "You can't bury what doesn't want to stay buried," she whispered. By winter, she had stopped sleeping. Her skin grew pale, her speech quiet and disjointed. She told Edward she saw people standing in the corners of their room at night, burned men and women with hollow eyes whispering his name. He called for a doctor who declared it female hysteria and prescribed laudanum. But medicine could not cure what haunted her. The servants began to leave one by one. Some refused to enter certain rooms, especially the upstairs nursery, where Clara claimed she saw a woman in tattered white, cradling an invisible infant. When Edward checked, the room was empty, but the cradle in the corner rocked on its own. One night, during a thunderstorm, Edward awoke to find Clara gone. Lightning illuminated the bedroom just enough for him to see muddy footprints leading out into the hall. He followed them, calling her name, until he reached the charred remains of the old ballroom. There, in the flash of another strike, he saw her standing barefoot among the ashes, her nightdress soaked and clinging to her skin. "Clara!" he shouted, rushing to her. But she didn't move. Her eyes were wide and glassy, fixed on the far wall where the burned plaster had peeled away. There, drawn in soot and old blood, was the faint outline of a door that no longer existed. She whispered, "They're still here." When he reached her, she turned slowly to face him. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the cracked mirror fragment on the floor beside her. But when he looked into the glass, he didn't see her. He saw himself standing behind her, eyes black and burning. The next morning, Clara was found sitting silently in bed, her hair gray at the roots, though she was only 23. She would not speak, not to Edward, not to anyone. Within a month, she was sent away to a private asylum outside Charleston. The doctors wrote in their notes that she suffered from progressive madness brought on by isolation and delusion. But Edward knew, deep down, that she had seen something real. Still, pride would not let him abandon the estate. Instead, he remarried within the year. His second wife, Lydia, was practical and fearless, dismissive of ghost talk. She lasted 3 months before she too began waking in the night, screaming that someone was whispering her name through the walls. By the end of the decade, the Hartwell estate would claim 5 wives, each descending into madness in eerily similar fashion. each whispering of voices, of faces in mirrors, of smoke that never faded. And though the town blamed Edward's cruelty, or the isolation, or the curse of the land, there was one thing no one dared to mention aloud, that the old Caldwell mirror, cracked and burned, still hung in the hall, and sometimes when the light struck it just right, the face reflected in the glass was not the one standing before it. By 1883, the Hartwell mansion stood like a corpse among the Kentucky fields, its windows blackened, its chimneys crumbling, its gardens strangled by vines. Yet still, someone lived inside. Edward Hartwell, gray now and hollow-eyed, refused to leave the house where all 5 of his wives had fallen to madness. The locals whispered that the devil had taken root in those walls, that the soil beneath was salted with human sorrow. But Edward's 5th wife, Margaret, did not believe in curses. She was a woman of intelligence and temper, born in Boston, a widow twice over, and utterly unafraid of shadows. When she married Edward, she thought herself immune to the tragedies that had consumed his previous wives. She told herself those women were weak, delicate, frightened by their own imaginations. She was different, or so she believed. On her first night in the mansion, Margaret walked its halls with a lantern in hand. The air was heavy with mildew and age, and each step on the rotting floorboards echoed like a sigh. Edward showed her the library, the ballroom, and the long hall lined with portraits of his past wives. Their eyes seemed to follow her. One frame stood empty. "Who was meant to hang here?" she asked. Edward hesitated, his face tightening. "That portrait was never finished," he said softly. "The artist died before he could complete it." But that was a lie. The truth was that Clara's portrait, the first wife, had burned in a fire that never spread. The flames had consumed only her likeness, leaving the rest of the hall untouched. Margaret laughed when she heard such tales from the servants. "Fire that burns a painting and nothing else?" she scoffed. "You country folk will believe anything." Still, that night she dreamed of a woman with gray eyes and a veil of ash whispering her name. The next morning, Margaret found her mirror cracked clean down the middle. Edward blamed the humidity, but when she tried to replace it, the glass cutter refused. "I don't go near that house," he said. "No mirror cut for it stays whole." By the second week, Margaret began to notice something peculiar. Each time she walked past a mirror, whether in the parlor, the hallway, or even the small hand mirror on her vanity, her reflection seemed slightly off. Sometimes the eyes blinked slower than hers, sometimes the lips moved when hers did not, and once, when she leaned close, her reflection smiled. She dropped the mirror, shattering it into dozens of pieces. When she told Edward, he grew angry. "Enough," he snapped. "I've lived through this madness before. I won't endure it again." But Margaret saw it then, the flicker of fear behind his rage. The man who had buried 5 wives did not fear ghosts, he feared proof. That night, she crept into the east wing, where Edward forbade her to go. The air there was colder, the floor thick with dust. Her lantern light trembled as she reached the old ballroom, the same place where Clara had been found all those years ago. The walls were still blackened from fire, and there, in the far corner, half buried beneath fallen plaster, stood an old tall mirror. Its surface was warped and gray, but when she lifted the lantern toward it, the glass caught the light and shimmered faintly. She should have turned away. Instead, she stepped closer. The reflection that looked back at her was not her own. It was Clara, pale, hollow-eyed, her mouth moving silently as though struggling to speak. Then, faintly, Margaret heard it, not with her ears, but deep within her mind. "He doesn't see, he doesn't listen, he doesn't die." The lantern sputtered. Smoke curled upward, though nothing burned, and just before the light went out, Clara's reflection reached toward her, the glass trembling as though it were breathing. When Edward found her hours later, Margaret was kneeling before the mirror, her hand pressed against its surface. She was muttering softly, rhythmically, her eyes unfocused. "What are you doing?" he demanded. She turned slowly. "Listening," she said. "They're telling me what you did." Edward struck her. The sound echoed down the corridor, swallowed by the walls. He dragged her back to their room, locking the door. "You'll not speak of this again," he said, but when he lay beside her he could not sleep. Because every time he closed his eyes he saw Clara's face staring at him from the darkness. The next morning Margaret was gone. The servants said they saw her walking toward the fields at dawn, barefoot, her white nightdress billowing in the wind. Edward searched for hours, but she was nowhere to be found. 3 days later, a child found her body in the creek, though body was hardly the word. Her skin was pale and smooth, her eyes open but unseeing, her mouth frozen in a half-smile. There was no water in her lungs. She had not drowned. In her hand she clutched a small shard of mirror glass. When the sheriff came, he asked Edward what had happened. The old man simply said she was not strong enough. But the sheriff noticed something else. Every mirror in the house had been covered with white sheets. When he asked why, Edward only muttered, "They've seen too much." That night, as Edward sat alone in the study, he poured himself whiskey and stared at the sheeted mirrors. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. He thought of the 5 women who had come into his life full of light and left broken, silent, or dead. He wondered for the first time if the curse was not in them, but in him. As the clock struck midnight, he saw movement beneath one of the sheets. Slowly the fabric lifted, as though pulled by an unseen hand. Beneath it the mirror gleamed faintly, and reflected in its surface were 5 figures, 5 women standing behind him, their eyes empty, their mouths open in a voiceless scream. Edward turned, but the room was empty. When he looked back, his reflection was gone. The next morning, the servants found him slumped in the chair, his face gray and lifeless, his eyes wide open, fixed on the covered mirror. The doctor wrote that he had suffered a heart attack, but one of the servants swore that as she entered the room, she caught a glimpse of the mirror before covering it again, and inside it she could see Edward Hartwell still sitting there, breathing, only his reflection. After Edward Hartwell's death, the mansion stood silent for nearly a decade. Locals avoided the property, crossing themselves when they passed by the rusted gates. The estate fell into disrepair, its roof sagged, windows shattered, vines coiling through the cracks like serpents reclaiming their nest. Yet, in 1893, the house stirred again. A distant relative named Jonathan Hartwell, an art historian from Virginia, inherited the property. He was a man of reason, skeptical of superstition, and more interested in the estate's rumored art collection than its macabre reputation. When he arrived, the villagers warned him, "Leave the mirrors covered, and never go upstairs after midnight." Jonathan smiled politely but ignored them. His first impression of the mansion was one of decay and dignity, a relic gasping for breath. The grand staircase, though warped, still held traces of elegance. The chandeliers, thick with dust, glimmered faintly when light struck their crystals. But it was the portrait hall that drew him most. 10 portraits hung there, 5 men, 5 women, all dressed in 19th-century finery. He recognized Edward immediately from a faded daguerreotype he had once seen. Cold eyes, sharp jaw, the face of a man who had commanded fear rather than affection. But it was the portraits of the wives that transfixed him. Each woman's expression was subtly wrong, eyes too wide, smiles too tight, painted as if the artist had glimpsed something terrible before finishing. And at the end of the hall, there was the infamous empty frame. Its canvas was slashed clean down the center, the edges charred. Yet something about it made the air colder. The brass plaque beneath read only, "Clara Hartwell, 1846 to 1869. Jonathan felt a tremor he couldn't explain. He moved closer, noting faint markings along the frame, scratches, as if someone had clawed at it from inside. When he ran his thumb across them, the wood felt warm. He decided, half out of curiosity, half out of compulsion, to restore the painting. That evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Jonathan brought the frame to his study. He unrolled a fresh canvas, matching its dimensions to the frame. As he sketched, he realized his hand moved almost automatically, as if guided by a will not his own. Without reference or memory, he began to recreate the face of Clara Hartwell. Long dark hair, pale skin, gray eyes that shimmered faintly with sorrow. Hours passed. The storm outside deepened, thunder echoing like footsteps. When Jonathan finally looked up, his candle had nearly burned out. The portrait was almost complete, but something was wrong. The eyes, those gray, mournful eyes, seemed alive. He stepped back, heart pounding. The room felt suffocatingly still. Then came a whisper, soft, feminine, and impossibly close. "You found me." Jonathan froze. The sound had not come from the hall, it had come from the painting. The candle flickered. For an instant, Clara's painted eyes shifted, looking directly into his. He stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. The portrait's lips parted slightly as if to speak again, but then the candle went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Jonathan groped for the matches, hands trembling. When he struck one, the sudden light illuminated the portrait, and his breath caught. The face was no longer painted. It was photographic, too detailed, too real. The brushstrokes were gone, replaced by a sheen of living flesh beneath the canvas. He fled. By morning, he convinced himself it had been fatigue, imagination twisted by the storm. Yet when he returned to the study, the canvas had changed again. The woman's eyes were now closed as if she slept. He sealed the room and left the house that day, traveling to Lexington to consult a restorer friend named Henry Goss. Henry laughed when Jonathan described the experience. "You've been breathing too much linseed oil," he said. "Bring it here and I'll show you it's just paint." But Jonathan never made it to Lexington. A week later, 2 farmers found his horse grazing near the river. His body was discovered half a mile downstream, face pale, eyes wide open, lips blue. There were no wounds, no signs of drowning. In his coat pocket was a note, written in a hurried, uneven hand. "Don't finish the portrait. She wakes when it's done." Henry Goss, curious and skeptical, traveled to the mansion to investigate. He found the study door locked from the inside. After breaking it open, he discovered the portrait hanging once more in its frame, fully finished. Clara Hartwell stared back at him, her expression almost serene. But behind her, faintly visible in the background of the painting, were 5 other faces, blurred, distorted, but unmistakably female. Henry felt a chill crawl up his spine. He stepped closer, realizing that the texture of the painting wasn't smooth. The surface seemed to breathe. The next day, Henry left town without a word. He sold his business in Lexington within the month and disappeared to Europe. When asked why, his apprentice said he'd been raving about eyes that follow you in your sleep. The mansion, once again, was abandoned. No one dared to enter. But stories spread of travelers passing by at night and seeing a faint light flickering in the portrait hall, of a woman's voice singing softly through the broken windows, and of an artist's shadow moving where no living man remained. And though no one had entered the house for years, villagers swore that the Hartwell family portraits sometimes changed. The women's faces appeared older, their expressions shifted, and the empty frame at the end of the hall, it was no longer empty. Within it, faint and fading, was the image of Jonathan Hartwell, his eyes closed, his lips slightly parted, as if whispering from inside the painted world he had helped complete. By the turn of the century, the mansion had earned a new name among the locals, the Gallery of the Damned, and even today, when the moon is full and the fog rolls through the Kentucky hills, those who wander too close claim to hear the sound of a brush scraping canvas and a whisper calling from beyond the walls, "One more stroke, and we will all be free." By the summer of 1843, the plantation was quiet. Too quiet. The fields lay untouched under the boiling Carolina sun, the air thick with the memory of screams no one dared mention. The slave quarters were half empty, and those who remained moved like ghosts, whispering prayers in languages long forbidden. The master's house, once filled with laughter and the faint notes of piano keys, was now a tomb where echoes lingered longer than the living. In that oppressive silence walked Elijah. His shoulders were broad, his eyes hollow, and his steps deliberate, like a man who had already walked through hell and come back only to find it waiting again. They called him the one who survived the chains, though no one spoke the story out loud. He had seen his kin burned, his wife taken, his soul broken by years of cruelty that stripped everything but rage. The new overseer, Mr. Rutledge, had arrived from Charleston only a month prior. He'd heard whispers about the slave who would not kneel. He thought it was superstition, a tale spun to frighten newcomers. But one look at Elijah, standing alone beneath the magnolia tree with his head held high, told him this was no ordinary man. That night, Rutledge decided to test him. He called Elijah to the great hall, where the remaining house slaves were gathered. The chandeliers flickered, their light warped by the humidity. On the grand table sat wine, whips, and a pistol, a grotesque reflection of the house's new order. "Elijah," Rutledge said, his voice calm but venomous, "I hear you think yourself better than your betters." "That true?" Elijah said nothing. His silence stretched like a blade. Rutledge chuckled. "Then prove your worth. The master's sons think themselves strong. Let's see if you can break them as you broke his rules." The room fell still. The sons, two pale, trembling boys no older than 20, stood frozen, their fear thick as the air. Rutledge wasn't talking about labor, he was talking about degradation, a reversal of power so blasphemous even the walls seemed to shudder. Elijah's jaw tightened, his hands clenched, veins bulging beneath his skin. He could hear the echo of his mother's screams, the crack of his father's back beneath the whip, the laughter of white men as they took everything sacred. He looked Rutledge in the eyes. "If this is what your God asks of men, then you worship the devil." Before anyone could breathe, Rutledge struck him across the face with the butt of his pistol. Blood pooled on the floor. The sons recoiled, and the slaves wept silently. But Elijah didn't fall. He stood tall, his breath steady, his eyes burning like a storm. With a slow, deliberate motion, he wiped the blood from his lip and whispered, "I will not kneel." The room erupted into chaos. Rutledge screamed for the guards, but something in the air had changed, something ancient and terrible. The chandeliers swayed though no wind blew, the candles guttered, the shadows stretched longer than they should have, curling up the walls like claws. One of the sons began to convulse, his body twisted, his mouth foaming. The other screamed as blood seeped from his nose. Rutledge stumbled back, shouting orders no one obeyed. Elijah stood unmoving, eyes locked on the writhing boys. It wasn't his doing, or maybe it was. Maybe years of rage, injustice, and desecration had birthed something inside him that refused to die quietly. The overseer's pistol clicked, but before he could fire, the doors burst open. A storm had come, sheets of rain and thunder cracking like cannon fire. Lightning illuminated the room, and for a split second, Rutledge saw something behind Elijah, the faint outline of chains hanging in the air, glowing red-hot, moving of their own accord. Rutledge screamed and fired. The shot rang through the hall, but Elijah didn't fall. The bullet tore through his shoulder, yet he took another step forward, then another. The overseer stumbled, dropped his weapon, and fell to his knees. Outside, the magnolia tree groaned as if in pain. By morning, the house was empty. The overseer's body was found near the gate, eyes wide open, mouth twisted in terror. The master's sons were gone. Elijah was never seen again. But in the years that followed, travelers passing through swore they heard strange noises near the magnolia grove at night. Chains dragging against the dirt, a man whispering prayers in a language no one knew, and sometimes laughter. The townsfolk began to say that the land had cursed itself, that no master could own what was built on blood. The magnolia tree grew massive, its roots curling like fingers over the graves no one had marked. Decades later, when the war came and the plantations burned, soldiers who wandered near the old Hartwell fields found carvings on the bark of that same tree, symbols that looked like chains, looping into the shape of a man's eyes. And when they camped there, they said the earth breathed in its sleep. The very notion of a blood oath carries with it an ancient, almost primeval weight. In the context of Solomon, the captor in this historical nightmare, it represents a fusion of fear, superstition, and brutal psychological control. To understand this keynote fully, we need to examine the oath itself, the setting, its psychological and social consequences, and the legacy it left on those unfortunate enough to witness his deeds. At its core, the blood oath is not merely a promise, it is a binding of the human spirit under threat of supernatural or mortal retribution. The victims, captives of Solomon, were forced to swear upon the bones of their ancestors, the remains of those who had long passed, whose silence and memory were now leveraged as instruments of terror. By invoking the bones, Solomon wasn't just wielding intimidation, he was invoking a sacred trust, a tangible link to the past that made breaking the oath unthinkable. In many 18th and 19th century cultures, ancestors were revered, their spirits considered watchers over the living. To swear on their remains, therefore, was to bind oneself not only legally or physically, but spiritually. The implication was clear. To break the oath was to bring dishonor, misfortune, or worse, a curse upon oneself. The phrase never to reveal what they saw hints at the horrors Solomon inflicted within his domain. The blood oath was, in effect, a tool to enforce absolute silence, creating a psychological barrier more effective than walls, locks, or chains. Captives were not only bound physically, they were bound morally, spiritually, and emotionally. Fear of the curse, coupled with the sacred weight of their ancestors' bones, ensured compliance even when they were free to speak. In this sense, the oath functioned as an invisible prison, extending Solomon's control far beyond his immediate presence. The curse of his name is a particularly chilling element. It implies that Solomon's reputation itself was a weapon. In communities surrounding his sphere of influence, merely invoking his name carried dread. For the captives, speaking out would not just betray the oath, it would summon the intangible yet terrifying wrath of Solomon. His name became an ever-present reminder of his reach, his power, and the consequences of disobedience. Even long after leaving captivity, survivors would be haunted by this legacy, conditioned to silence, lest they risk social, spiritual, or even physical retribution. From a psychological perspective, forcing someone to swear on the bones of their ancestors instills a unique form of trauma. It exploits cultural beliefs and deep-seated reverence for lineage, merging fear with guilt. Survivors of Solomon's domain would carry this guilt and fear for life. Even if they wished to speak, the oath itself, cemented in ritual and bound by ancestral bones, would act as a mental chain. Over time, the memory of what they saw would become almost mythic, a haunting secret carried internally, shaping their interactions, their trust in others, and their perception of power. Socially, the blood oath reinforced Solomon's absolute dominion. Within the hierarchy of his captives and underlings, it created a system where silence was self-enforced. When fear and reverence intersect, enforcement becomes unnecessary. The captives themselves became instruments of control. In this way, Solomon's power transcended his physical presence. The mere threat of the oath's curse ensured loyalty, complicity, or at the very least, silence. Neighbors, fellow captives, and later generations would whisper of the horrors in Solomon's domain, feeding the mythos of a man whose authority extended beyond the natural world into the spiritual and moral realms. The oath also touches on a broader theme, the manipulation of morality and spirituality to consolidate control. By intertwining fear of ancestral wrath with loyalty to his commands, Solomon blurred the lines between cultural piety and survival instinct. Captives would be torn between honoring their ancestors and obeying the imposed authority of a tyrant. The blood oath thus became a cruel inversion of traditional reverence. What was meant to sanctify life and lineage was weaponized to enforce obedience and conceal atrocities. In historical context, such practices were not unheard of, though Solomon's brand of terror seems particularly calculated and systemic. Many tyrants and captors leveraged superstition, sacred oaths, and fear of curses to maintain control over populations that might otherwise resist. But the added element of swearing on ancestral bones introduces a profound layer of psychological horror. It is one thing to be threatened by a master's wrath. It is another to feel as though the spirits of one's own forebears are complicit in one's punishment for breaking the oath. This act of coercion leaves survivors caught in a permanent limbo, trapped between loyalty to family and instinctive self-preservation. Finally, the lasting impact of the blood oath on storytelling and oral history is significant. The whisperings of survivors, the passing down of their fears, and the mention of the curse of his name ensured that Solomon's name lingered long after his immediate actions. It shaped not only how captives interacted with the world, but how their communities perceived power, fear, and silence. The blood oath became more than a moment of terror. It became a legend, a cautionary tale of the terrifying intersection of mortal cruelty and spiritual manipulation. In sum, this keynote encapsulates multiple layers of horror: physical domination, psychological torment, spiritual manipulation, and enduring myth-making. Solomon's forced oath demonstrates the terrifying extent of his control, extending even beyond death and into the very conscience of his captives. The bones of their ancestors, once symbols of reverence, became instruments of fear. His name became a talisman of dread, and the oath itself, a simple promise, was elevated into a binding contract that outlived time. In the whispers of survivors, this blood oath lived on, a haunting reminder that some horrors are too sacred, too profane, and too enduring to ever be spoken aloud. The year 1839 marked the violent and irrevocable conclusion of one of the most feared legacies in plantation history. The phrase, "the fire of retribution," evokes a sense of both inevitability and divine justice, a purging of the cruelty and tyranny that had gripped Solomon's domain for decades. Unlike ordinary accidents or acts of arson, the fire carried with it layers of symbolism, retribution, liberation, and the terrifying mystery of a man whose influence defied even death. To understand this keynote fully, one must examine the context of Solomon's reign, the events leading to the fire, the physical and psychological ramifications of the flames, and the enduring legacy of a destruction so complete that it erased all traces of the tyrant himself. Solomon's plantation was a microcosm of fear incarnate. The estate had been built not just as a residence or a working farm, but as a prison of the human spirit. Captives lived under constant surveillance, bound by oaths, chained in cellars, or confined to the stables, where even the most basic dignity was stripped away. Tales of his cruelty spread in whispers across the surrounding settlements, carried by those who had narrowly escaped or survived to tell fragments of what they had seen. Yet, despite the terror, no force had ever successfully challenged Solomon until 1839. The fire was both literal and metaphorical. The burning of the plantation mirrored the destruction of his ironclad control and the final act of vengeance from a world long oppressed by his tyranny. The description that no body of Solomon was ever found adds a chilling ambiguity. Unlike his captives, whose fates were often visible and horrifying, Solomon's disappearance created a void of uncertainty. Did he perish in the flames, consumed by the inferno that claimed his dominion, or did he vanish, a phantom escaping judgment, leaving behind only a landscape of ruin? This uncertainty elevated Solomon from a mere mortal to a spectral figure in the folklore of the region, a man whose cruelty had been so profound that even death seemed reluctant to claim him. The absence of his body also served a dark poetic justice. While his captives had suffered under chains, oaths, and fear, he became an enigma, a name whispered with dread, his ultimate fate left to the imagination, just as he had once left his victims in terror. The image of the master's sons, chained and lifeless in the stables, is a harrowing testament to the moral inversion at the heart of the story. The sons of the plantation's owner, presumably raised in privilege and security, were not spared from the consequences of the cruelty their father either condoned or ignored. Their deaths, chained, powerless, and abandoned, suggest the indiscriminate nature of retribution. The fire, whether accidental or intentional, did not discriminate. It claimed those within the bounds of the plantation without distinction, except for the one who had long been untouchable, Solomon. The sight of the sons' lifeless bodies in the stables, a place normally associated with labor and subjugation, serves as a grim mirror to the suffering of the enslaved captives. The stables, a symbol of forced labor, became a mausoleum for the privileged, a reversal that underscores the story's dark poetic justice. The fire itself must be understood not merely as a destructive force, but as an instrument of narrative and historical symbolism. Fire in literature and folklore often represents cleansing, revelation, and transformation. In this case, it purged the physical manifestation of Solomon's tyranny while simultaneously preserving the legend of his cruelty. Ashes replaced timber and stone, leaving no walls to contain the memories of horrors enacted within them. For survivors and witnesses, the fire was both terrifying and liberating. It obliterated the place where so many had suffered while leaving behind a story, one that could be recounted in whispers around hearths or in the secret gatherings of those who had escaped. The flames, then, were both a literal and metaphorical reckoning, a final judgment enacted in the most elemental of ways. Psychologically, the aftermath of the fire left a scar on the collective memory of the region. Survivors carried with them the image of chained bodies, the smell of burning wood, and the haunting absence of Solomon. The trauma was compounded by the uncertainty of his fate. When a tyrant's death is witnessed, there is closure. When it is not, there is lingering dread, The survivors' imaginations filled the void with every imaginable horror. Perhaps Solomon had transformed into some malevolent specter, roaming forests and ruins, exacting vengeance on those who dared speak his name. The fire, while a purifying agent, thus also reinforced the mythic quality of Solomon's existence, embedding fear into local folklore for generations. From a historical standpoint, the fire reflects the often unpredictable intersection of human cruelty and cosmic or natural justice. Plantation records, eyewitness accounts, and local oral histories all point to a convergence of factors that made the destruction of the estate inevitable. Years of mismanagement, hidden tensions, and the simmering resentment of those oppressed under Solomon's regime created conditions ripe for catastrophe. Whether sparked accidentally or deliberately, the fire was a culmination of these pressures, a release valve for the pent-up violence that had simmered under the surface of the plantation's rigid order. The disappearance of Solomon's body introduces the enduring theme of legend versus history. Scholars and storytellers alike wrestle with the ambiguity. Was Solomon's vanishing act real, or was it mythologized by those desperate to impose meaning on chaos? The unanswered question ensures that his story transcends mere historical record, entering the realm of dark folklore. Like a shadow at the edge of memory, Solomon's absence forces confrontation with the unknown, reinforcing the psychological terror he cultivated in life. Even as the plantation burned, his power lingered, a reminder that fear does not die with the body. Finally, the fire's lasting impact lies in the moral resonance it carries. It is a stark reminder that tyranny, cruelty, and oppression often provoke reckoning, even if delayed or disguised in the ambiguity of legend. The image of the chained, lifeless sons juxtaposed with the untraceable tyrant paints a picture of cosmic irony. Those who were complicit or insulated by privilege are consumed by the consequences of the system they upheld, while the architect of terror escapes physical justice. The story teaches that the consequences of cruelty can be both immediate and generational, leaving scars on individuals, families, and entire communities. In conclusion, the fire of retribution is not merely an historical event, it is a narrative crucible where themes of vengeance, justice, terror, and ambiguity converge. The obliteration of the plantation in 1839 represents both the literal and symbolic end of a reign of terror. The absence of Solomon's body and the tragic deaths of the master's sons deepen the story's horror while reinforcing its moral complexity. Through fire, the estate was transformed from a place of oppression to a site of myth, memory, and cautionary legend. Survivors, witnesses, and later generations are left with images that linger: the smell of smoke, the roar of flames, the chains in the stables, and the whispered question of what truly became of Solomon. It is in this intersection of destruction, mystery, and enduring psychological terror that the keynote finds its full, haunting resonance. The legend of Solomon Brant is one of those rare and chilling tales where the line between history and myth blurs, leaving a permanent imprint on collective memory. By the time this keynote unfolds, Solomon had long vanished from the physical world. His body never recovered in the fire that destroyed his plantation. But his presence lingered, living on in whispers, warnings, and the imagination of a frightened populace. The phrase, "the legend that lived on," captures not only the persistence of his name but the enduring psychological terror he inspired. To unpack this keynote, one must explore how fear transforms into folklore, the mechanics of cultural memory, the role of storytelling in maintaining authority, and the haunting way legends like Solomon's shape generations. The first element to consider is the mechanism by which Solomon's terrifying deeds were transformed into legend. In life, he wielded fear directly, through oaths, chains, floggings, and the manipulation of ancestral reverence. But in death, or apparent disappearance, his influence could not be exercised through physical violence. Instead, it migrated into stories, warnings, and moral cautionary tales. Southern mothers, often tasked with instilling obedience and caution in their children, became conduits of this transformed fear. By telling their children, "Be good," or "Solomon Brant will come from the swamp for you," they converted real historical terror into a psychological tool. The swamp, mysterious and foreboding, served as a symbolic landscape, a liminal space between the known world and the unknown, a place where danger lurked and the moral law was enforced in ways beyond human comprehension. The use of Solomon's name in these warnings is critical. A legend gains potency when the figure is not only fearsome, but also present in the imagination. Even decades after his disappearance, the name Solomon Brant functioned as a talisman of fear. Unlike stories of generic monsters or abstract threats, this was the name of a real person who had committed real atrocities. There was authenticity in the terror, and that authenticity amplified the psychological impact of the legend. Children were not simply told to behave for the sake of abstract morality. They were confronted with a tangible, almost supernatural enforcer whose memory carried the weight of historical horrors. The setting of the swamp is particularly evocative. Swamps in southern folklore are liminal, wild, and dangerous, places where society's rules do not apply, where humans are small and powerless. To say that Solomon Brant could emerge from the swamp evokes the idea that he had transcended normal existence. No longer constrained by life or death, he became a mythic enforcer, capable of appearing anywhere, especially where disobedience or moral failure occurred. The swamp's darkness mirrors the darkness of Solomon's own history, a place where terror festers and where the boundaries between reality and imagination blur. By situating him in such a space, the legend ensures that Solomon's influence is both omnipresent and unknowable, feeding the primal fear in the minds of the young and impressionable. Another dimension of this keynote is the social function of legend. In many communities, storytelling serves to reinforce values, obedience, and conformity. In this case, the legend of Solomon Brant was used as a tool of social regulation. Children who obeyed were rewarded with safety. Those who disobeyed faced the imagined wrath of a figure whose deeds were terrifyingly real in collective memory. This is a continuation of Solomon's control through psychological means. Even after his death or disappearance, he maintained authority over the behavior of the living, a posthumous extension of the fear-based power he cultivated during life. The phrase "his name became myth, but the fear remained real" is central to understanding the enduring potency of the story. Myth here does not mean falsehood, it means transformation. Solomon was no longer a man bound by flesh and circumstance. He became a symbol, a narrative device, and a cautionary archetype. Yet, the fear, the emotional, physical, and instinctual reaction remained fully tangible. Adults remembered what had happened, children internalized it as a living threat. This duality, mythic figure versus real fear, creates a unique cultural phenomenon. It is one thing to read about horror in history, it is another to feel that horror in your daily life, to know that disobedience might summon consequences that cannot be rationally explained or defended against. The legend's longevity also reveals the power of oral tradition. Before widespread literacy or mass media, stories were passed from parent to child, generation to generation. Each telling added new layers, exaggerations, and local color, but the core of the legend, Solomon's terror, remained intact. Swamps, hidden corners, and the quiet of nighttime all became the stage upon which his myth played out. In this way, the legend adapted to survive the erosion of memory, ensuring that Solomon's presence continued to loom over children who had no first-hand experience of his cruelty. Psychologically, the legend also embodies the mechanism of fear as moral pedagogy. It demonstrates how horror can regulate behavior far more effectively than reward. The human brain is wired to remember threats. A story about a cruel, omnipresent figure like Solomon Brant imprints itself on the imagination, creating a mental model in which obedience equals safety and transgression equals punishment. For generations, this mental model reinforced societal norms and hierarchies, echoing the tyrant's control in a subtler yet profoundly effective way. Finally, the legend of Solomon Brant is a study in the persistence of trauma across generations. The fire that consumed the plantation, the mysterious disappearance, the chained sons in the stables, all these events were seared into collective memory. Even without direct experience, descendants and neighbors inherited the emotional residue of terror. Myth and memory converged to ensure that Solomon's legacy remained alive in the cultural consciousness, a ghostly authority whose moral and psychological power endured longer than any physical dominion. In conclusion, the legend that lived on illustrates the terrifying endurance of fear and the transformation of historical atrocity into myth. Solomon Brant transcended death to become a narrative tool, a cautionary figure, and a psychological enforcer. Through whispered warnings in the swamps of the South, through stories told by mothers to their children, his presence persisted, a chilling reminder that some terrors do not die, they evolve. The legend reflects not only the horrors of one man, but the way fear can shape societies, dictate behavior, and leave an indelible mark on generations long after the flames have consumed the physical world. Solomon Brant became both myth and memory, and in the minds of those who dared to speak his name, the fear remained as real as ever. As the shadows of the South lengthened over centuries, the legacy of Solomon Brant refused to fade. His name, once whispered in terror by captives and overseers alike, had become an indelible thread in the tapestry of American folklore. The plantation that had stood as a fortress of cruelty was reduced to ashes, and yet the stories endured, haunting generations long after the fire's smoke had cleared. This is the paradox of history. Even when stone and timber fall, memory persists. The blood, the fear, and the stories carried forward, a reminder that evil leaves traces far beyond the flesh it touches. The tale of Solomon Brant is not one of heroism or triumph, but of power and its abuse. It is a stark account of the darkest recesses of human nature and the lengths to which one man went to assert dominance over others. The captives, bound by oaths sworn upon the bones of their ancestors, were forced to live in silence, their suffering hidden from the world. Fear became their constant companion, and the mere mention of Solomon's name conjured a terror that transcended generations. Even after the flames consumed the plantation in 1839, the psychological chain Solomon had forged remained unbroken. He had transformed fear into legend, and in that transformation, his influence became immortal. When we examine the impact of the blood oath, it becomes evident that Solomon's cruelty extended beyond the physical. By making captives swear on ancestral bones, he manipulated the very core of human spirituality and morality. This act was not mere superstition. It was a calculated psychological weapon, one that forced obedience through guilt, terror, and reverence. Survivors carried this burden long after escaping his grasp, their silence a testimony to the oath's power. In modern terms, this represents the ultimate form of psychological control, where trauma is internalized and perpetuated, often subconsciously, across time. The echoes of Solomon's tyranny are a reminder of how fear can be weaponized to control not only individuals but entire communities. The destruction of the plantation, marked by the fire of 1839, is a pivotal moment in this narrative. It stands as a symbol of both retribution and liberation. The inferno that reduced walls and stables to ash did more than destroy property. It obliterated a locus of oppression. Yet, the absence of Solomon's body added a layer of enduring mystery. Did he perish in the blaze, consumed by the very destruction he had sown among others? Or did he escape, leaving a legacy of fear unbroken? The uncertainty of his fate transformed him from a tyrant of flesh and blood into a mythic figure, one whose specter could haunt the imagination indefinitely. In folklore and memory, ambiguity amplifies terror. It is the unknown that frightens more than the known, and Solomon's disappearance ensured that his influence outlived his mortality. The fire also underscores the themes of poetic justice and moral reckoning. While Solomon vanished, the master's sons were found chained and lifeless in the stables, victims of the same system their father had perpetuated. Here, the narrative reveals a grim truth about the cyclical nature of cruelty. Those who benefit from oppression are often ensnared in its consequences. The flames did not discriminate, they claimed innocence and complicity alike. This reversal emphasizes that tyranny cannot endure indefinitely without sowing the seeds of its own destruction. Nature, or fate, acts as a great equalizer, punishing both oppressors and the complacent who uphold their rule. The legend of Solomon Brant, perpetuated through oral tradition, became a tool of social instruction. For decades, Southern mothers used his name to enforce obedience, warning their children, "Be good," or "Solomon Brant will come from the swamp for you." This warning reflects the dual nature of the legend. myth and memory intertwined, teaching moral behavior while invoking genuine fear. Swamps, dark and mysterious, served as liminal spaces where societal rules did not apply, a perfect stage for the mythic Solomon to operate. By merging real historical horror with folkloric elements, the legend ensured that Solomon's influence persisted across generations, becoming a psychological anchor for social discipline. From a modern perspective, the enduring story of Solomon Brant also offers lessons about historical trauma and collective memory. Trauma is rarely confined to those who experience it directly. It echoes through families, communities, and cultural narratives. The fear inspired by Solomon's deeds became embedded in Southern culture, shaping behaviors and storytelling practices for decades. Scholars of history and folklore note that such narratives are essential in understanding the interplay between power, memory, and morality. Solomon's story is an exemplar of how individuals who wield fear as power can leave marks on both tangible history and intangible cultural consciousness. Furthermore, the tale of Solomon Brant resonates with universal human concerns, justice, morality, and the consequences of cruelty. While set in a specific time and place, the Antebellum South, its themes are timeless. The story warns of the dangers of unchecked power, the psychological manipulation of others, and the ways in which fear can persist long after the immediate threat has passed. In this sense, Solomon's legend transcends its historical context, serving as a cautionary tale about the enduring consequences of tyranny and the resilience of human memory. The story's dark imagery, the blood oath, chained captives, the fire, and the spectral presence of Solomon creates a narrative that is as haunting as it is instructive. Each element reinforces the others, weaving a tapestry of terror and moral reflection. The mythic quality of Solomon's name ensures that the story is more than a historical footnote. It becomes a cultural touchstone, a reminder that the past, especially its horrors, shapes the present and informs the future. For modern readers and creators, the legacy of Solomon Brant offers inspiration for exploring dark historical storytelling. His narrative demonstrates the power of blending history with myth, fact with legend, and psychological terror with moral reflection. Stories like these capture attention, provoke thought, and evoke deep emotional responses, qualities that make them highly engaging and shareable in today's digital landscape. Optimized for search engine optimization, narratives grounded in real historical events, enriched with folklore, and framed with compelling psychological and moral dimensions, attract readers searching for dark history, haunted legends, and tales of moral reckoning. In closing, the story of Solomon Brant is more than the chronicle of one man's cruelty. It is an exploration of human nature, fear, and the mechanisms through which memory and legend endure. From the blood oath that bound captives to the fire that consumed the plantation, from the myth whispered in swamps to the moral lessons etched into generations, Solomon's presence is felt long after the flames faded. He exists as a symbol of power, terror, and the enduring consequences of cruelty, a dark legend that refuses to be forgotten. His tale is a stark reminder that history is never truly silent, and that the shadows of the past continue to shape the moral and psychological landscapes of the present. Solomon Brant's story remains a haunting beacon for storytellers, historians, and those fascinated by the intersections of terror, myth, and morality. It exemplifies how fear, once carefully cultivated, can survive both fire and time, leaving a legacy as much in the mind as in memory. The plantation may lie in ruin, the captives long gone, and the flames of 1839 reduced to ash. But the legend, the fear, and the lessons endure. In this enduring darkness, we find both caution and fascination, a testament to the power of story to outlive the cruelty it recounts, and to illuminate the deepest, most terrifying corners of human history.